When most people hear the word hoarder, a very specific image comes to mind. Rooms stacked to the ceiling, narrow pathways between piles of objects, items that seem useless, broken, or expired. The reaction is often immediate and emotional. Confusion, frustration, even disgust. Why wouldn't someone just throw things away? But that question already assumes the wrong problem. Hoarding is not fundamentally about clutter. It's not about laziness, poor hygiene, or a lack of willpower. And it's not simply an exaggerated version of collecting. At its core, hoarding is a psychological response to perceived loss, uncertainty, and threat. The objects are visible. The fear behind them usually isn't. This misunderstanding matters because when behavior is misinterpreted, it's judged instead of understood. And hoarding, more than many other behaviors, is easy to judge precisely because it looks irrational from the outside. To someone without hoarding tendencies, the solution seems obvious: discard what isn't needed. But psychologically, hoarding does not operate in the realm of logic. It operates in the realm of safety and meaning. To understand hoarding, you have to stop asking why someone keeps things and start asking what those things represent. One of the biggest misconceptions is that hoarding is just extreme messiness. Messiness is disorganization. Hoarding is attachment. A messy person may feel relief after cleaning. A person with hoarding tendencies often feels anxiety, grief, or panic at the idea of discarding. That emotional response is the key difference. Another common confusion is between hoarding and collecting. Collectors curate. They categorize, organize, and often display their items. Hoarding lacks this sense of control. Objects accumulate not because they're valued for their uniqueness, but because discarding them feels unsafe. The distinction isn't how much is owned, it's how difficult it is to let go. Psychologically, hoarding behavior often develops gradually. It rarely starts with extreme accumulation. It begins with hesitation, pausing before throwing something away, feeling unsure, thinking I might need this later. Over time, that hesitation becomes habitual. The threshold for discarding rises. The environment slowly changes, not through intention, but through avoidance. Avoidance is central here. Discarding objects triggers discomfort, sometimes intense discomfort. Anxiety increases. Thoughts spiral. What if I regret this? What if this was important? What if I'm making a mistake? Keeping the item relieves that discomfort temporarily. The relief reinforces the behavior. The brain learns that holding on reduces anxiety, at least in the short term. This is why hoarding isn't about ignorance. Many people who hoard are fully aware that they have too much. What they struggle with isn't recognition. It's emotional regulation. The objects act as emotional stabilizers, even when they create practical problems. And this is where judgment becomes especially harmful. Forcing someone to discard items without addressing the psychological meaning behind them often intensifies distress. The environment may change temporarily, but the underlying fear remains. Without understanding the emotional function of hoarding, the behavior tends to return. So when we look at hoarding psychologically, what we see is not carelessness, but overcaring. Not indifference, but heightened sensitivity to loss. Not laziness, but paralysis driven by anxiety. Once you move past the visible clutter, hoarding becomes less about objects and more about how the mind processes loss, value, and uncertainty. The difficulty isn't knowing that something could be thrown away. It's what happens psychologically when that possibility is considered. At the center of hoarding behavior is fear, not the dramatic kind, but a persistent, low-level sense that letting go is risky. This fear is often vague and difficult to articulate. It isn't always tied to a specific outcome. Instead, it feels like a general sense that something bad might happen if an item is discarded. The object becomes a safeguard against an undefined future threat. For many people with hoarding tendencies, this fear is rooted in earlier experiences of instability. Loss doesn't have to be extreme to shape behavior. Repeated disruptions, inconsistent caregiving, sudden changes, or periods of deprivation can all teach the mind that security is fragile. When that lesson settles in, the brain begins to prioritize retention over release. Objects then take on a psychological role that goes far beyond their function. They become anchors. Holding on to them creates a sense of continuity when internal stability feels uncertain. Discarding them, even trivial items, can feel like removing a piece of that anchor. Memory plays a major role here. People who hoard often experience strong emotional responses tied to objects, even when the objects themselves seem insignificant. A receipt, an old container, a piece of packaging. These items may be linked to moments, identities, or past versions of the self. Letting go of the object can feel like letting go of proof that those moments existed. This is where hoarding differs from simple nostalgia. Nostalgia is selective. Hoarding is indiscriminate. The problem isn't that objects are meaningful, it's that everything might be meaningful. When the mind struggles to rank emotional value, it defaults to keeping everything. Cognitively, this creates a specific kind of overload. Each decision, keep or discard, feels disproportionately heavy. The brain treats the choice as high stakes, even when the item is low value. Anxiety rises, thoughts loop, and the safest option becomes inaction. Not deciding feels better than deciding wrong. Over time, this leads to decision paralysis. The environment becomes more cluttered, not because the person wants it to, but because each additional object adds to the mental burden of choice. The more there is, the harder it becomes to start. This reinforces avoidance, which temporarily reduces anxiety but strengthens the pattern. Another important cognitive factor is distorted perception of utility. People with hoarding tendencies often overestimate how likely they are to need an item in the future. This isn't dishonesty, it's a miscalculation driven by uncertainty and tolerance. When the future feels unpredictable, the mind compensates by keeping more options open. Objects represent potential solutions, even if those solutions are improbable. Trauma can intensify this pattern, though it isn't always obvious. Experiences involving sudden loss of people, homes, stability, or control can leave lasting imprints. The mind learns that things disappear unexpectedly. Keeping becomes a way to protect against that lesson repeating itself. Importantly, the trauma doesn't need to be consciously remembered to influence behavior. There's also a strong emotional response to waste. Many people who hoard feel deep discomfort at the idea of discarding usable items. Throwing something away can feel morally wrong, even if it's damaged or outdated. This often connects to internalized beliefs about responsibility, scarcity, or gratitude. The object becomes a symbol of obligation. Interestingly, this sense of obligation is rarely applied evenly. People may hold on to items they never use while feeling guilty about discarding them, yet feel overwhelmed by the resulting clutter. This creates internal conflict, wanting relief but fearing release. From the outside, the behavior appears contradictory. From the inside, it's consistent. Keeping items reduces immediate anxiety. Discarding increases it. The brain learns to prioritize short-term emotional relief, even when long-term consequences are negative. Another cognitive feature often present is over-identification with possessions. Objects aren't just owned, they feel like extensions of the self. Losing them can feel like losing part of one's identity. This is especially common when personal history feels fragmented or unresolved. Objects then become external memory storage, holding continuity the mind struggles to maintain internally. Importantly, none of this implies a lack of intelligence or awareness. Many people with hoarding tendencies are thoughtful, reflective, and capable of understanding their behavior. The difficulty lies in emotional processing, not reasoning. Knowing that an item can be discarded does not eliminate the fear associated with doing so. This is why purely logical approaches rarely work. Telling someone that an object has no value doesn't address what the object represents psychologically. The fear isn't about the object, it's about what might be lost with it. At a certain point, hoarding stops being a response to fear alone and becomes a system. The environment, chaotic as it may appear, starts to function as a psychological structure. Every object, every pile, every narrow pathway serves a purpose that isn't immediately obvious from the outside. One of the most important functions hoarding provides is control. For individuals who feel overwhelmed by unpredictability, socially, emotionally, or existentially, objects offer something rare: reliability. They stay where they are placed. They don't change their demands. They don't reject or disappoint. In a world that often feels intrusive or unstable, possessions become a domain where the individual has authority. This sense of control is not always conscious. It shows up subtly in the way items are arranged, grouped, or protected. Even when the environment looks disorganized, the person often knows exactly where things are. Attempts by others to rearrange or remove items can feel deeply invasive, not because of the objects themselves, but because control is being taken away. Safety operates in a similar way. For some people, physical clutter creates a psychological boundary. The accumulation of objects can reduce social intrusion by making the space less accessible to others. This isn't always intentional, but it can function as a barrier, keeping the outside world at a distance. In this sense, hoarding can be understood as a form of environmental regulation. The space becomes a buffer between the individual and perceived threats. Clearing that space may feel like removing armor rather than restoring order. Objects also serve as emotional placeholders. They hold feelings that are difficult to process directly. Loneliness, grief, unresolved attachment, or unmet needs can all be projected onto possessions. The object doesn't just exist, it contains something emotionally charged. Letting it go can feel like releasing an emotion that has no other place to go. This is especially relevant when relationships have been unstable or disappointing. When trust in people is fragile, objects become safer substitutes. They are predictable, non-judgmental, and enduring. The emotional investment that might otherwise go into relationships can shift toward possessions instead. Another key element is identity preservation. Objects help tell a story about who someone has been, what they cared about, and what mattered to them at different points in life. For individuals whose sense of identity feels fractured or threatened, possessions become evidence of continuity. They prove that the self has existed across time. This is why discarding can feel like erasing chapters of one's life. Even objects that no longer serve a function may serve a narrative purpose. They say, "I was this person once." Hoarding also offers a kind of emotional buffering. When stress increases, the environment stays the same. When the outside world feels demanding, the internal logic of the space remains familiar. This consistency can be calming, even if it's also overwhelming. Ironically, the same environment that provides comfort can also contribute to distress. Many people who hoard feel trapped by their possessions. They experience shame, frustration, and exhaustion related to the clutter. The system that once offered safety becomes a source of suffering, but changing it feels riskier than maintaining it. This is where outside intervention often fails. Removing objects without addressing the underlying psychological function creates a vacuum. The behavior wasn't random, it was solving something. When that solution is taken away abruptly, the fear and distress intensify. Without alternative ways to regulate emotion and regain control, the mind often returns to accumulation. It's also important to note that hoarding exists on a spectrum. Many people display mild forms of the same tendencies, keeping items just in case, struggling to discard sentimental objects, feeling anxious about waste. The difference lies in degree, not kind. Hoarding reflects an amplification of processes that exist in many minds. Understanding hoarding in this way doesn't mean ignoring the real risks it can pose. It means recognizing that the behavior is functional, even when it's harmful. It persists because it works, at least emotionally. Until the needs it fulfills are addressed, the behavior remains. Hoarding, then, is not simply about objects or mess. It's about how humans cope with uncertainty, loss, and identity. It's about what happens when safety feels scarce and control feels threatened. The clutter is visible, the reasons are not. And perhaps that's why hoarding provokes such strong reactions. It confronts us with a question most people prefer not to ask. What do we hold on to when letting go feels dangerous? Not to answer it, not to resolve it, just to understand why the question exists at all.